Hi there. Welcome to Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for being with me today. So normally on this show, we talk about politics, history, and political science. But today we're going to do something a little bit different. We'll be talking about technology. And that fits within my own background because not only am I a journalist, but I also am a system administrator and website programmer. So you guys, for those of you who are not into technology, hopefully you will be able to listen to or watch the whole thing here today. So, it's an interesting topic, but it's definitely a little different. So, but anyway, so today, the topic of today's show is the Linux operating system, which just recently celebrated its 30th anniversary. It was released originally in 1991 by Linus Torvalds. He is now one of the most famous programmers in the world, and his operating system, which is used by all of the top supercomputers in the world, is used by the majority of smartphones in the world on the Android operating system. Even though a lot of people don't realize that Linux is something that they probably use themselves every day, whether they know it or not. So for today, we're going to talk about some of the history of where Linux came from and why it rocketed to success the way it did, or eased its way into success, depending on the sector you're looking at. So today we're going to be talking about the history of Linux with Miguel de Icaza. He is a distinguished engineer at Microsoft, which is another story in and of itself, because originally Microsoft was very anti-Linux. So I'm happy to have Miguel here with me today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Matthew.
All right. Well, so, you are somebody who has a very long history with Linux yourself, and with a lot of different operating systems, and we'll get into all that. So that's why I wanted you to be the guest today to talk about all this. So I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. So you are from Mexico originally, and that was when you first started using Linux as a university student in 1991, not too long after Linus had released it. So tell us a little bit about how you got into it, or why you did.
I think it was the first week of, it was probably the first week of college, and I ran into this really fun guy, which I knew from reputation and from the BBSs. His name was Fernando Magariños, and I just adored him because he was so funny in the forums. He was somebody that I love reading because everything he said was incredibly funny, and he, so I fanboyed him a little bit in the hallways, and we had just recently gotten some Unix systems at the university I was working at, and these systems really didn't have any software. And he said, "Oh, well, listen, you have these Unix machines. If you want to spice them up with software, you should go to this side." And he gave me a stack of papers, and he gave it away for free. It was a stack of papers that contained lists of FTP sites. And this was
and what is an FTP site, for those who don't know what that is?
It used to be machines that shared software. So this was a directory. It was like a yellow pages of free software that was available on the net. And he said, the first thing you want to go get the GNU stuff, because they give you text editors for free and they give you compilers for free. They're optimized for your machine. So I went and did that, and it was like being a kid at a candy store. There was so much software, but he was right. In particular, the GNU software was very well done. It was very comprehensive, and among those things, there were a couple of documents in those sites, and one of them was the GNU manifesto, where Richard Stallman explained why he had to build a free operating system from the ground up. So I fell in love with the GNU manifesto, and I was looking forward one day to repay to this community of people what they had done for me, right? Which they had given me all this free software that I had no idea I could get. And what was radical, right? What was very radical from the BBS, by the bulletin boards that existed at the time, is that the software at the time that you could get for PCs was locked up. You could get the software, it would be amazing, but you couldn't see how it was done or how it worked. And the GNU people had decided that this knowledge, this very hard-earned knowledge that you could only get at the best universities or if you work at the best places in the industry, was shared with everybody. So I was in awe that somebody would give away all that free knowledge. And I learned so much just from reading their code. I was incredibly grateful, and I started to look forward to how I could contribute. They said, you can give money. Well, I didn't have money, so I couldn't give them that. Or you can evangelize, or you can share the code, or you can contribute code. So I decided to help in any way I could, except money, right? So that's what I did. That's how I got started. Then, after this, Linux was the missing piece of the GNU system. It was, GNU was a nice addition that you could put to an existing Unix system, but Linux was the way of having a system from the ground up, from the moment that your computer started, and running all your software and be entirely free, and you could learn from every part of it. So it was like catnip for software developers. So when Linux came out, I immediately rallied to use it and install it and be part of that community.
All right. So the other thing for Linux that was interesting, because at the moment in time in the late 80s, early 90s, you had a lot of different Unix compatible vendors out there that were selling these versions of Unix, but they were all just a little bit different. And so as a developer, it was kind of a nightmare to port your software to the different platforms. And then, of course, all the platforms were using proprietary, very expensive custom hardware that was just out of reach for everybody. So there were a lot of problems, and Unix as a operating system really never took off, and DOS and Windows and Mac just utterly dominated the desktop space and the software space. So, was that how it was for you, and how did you see it at that time?
Yeah, certainly the high-end vendors like Digital and HP and Silicon Graphics, they were selling high-end hardware that was out of reach for most people. And even those that tried to go into the mass market, like Apple had AUX and Microsoft had Xenix, I imagine that they had some license agreement that prevented them from doing much around pricing, but it was certainly expensive and it was not available, right? So I actually never got a chance to play with Xenix. AUX, I think I saw it almost as a museum piece years after. But Linux was available. Linux was available and was free, and I could learn from it. So yeah, I think it took off, and I became an evangelist of Linux almost overnight.
Yeah. Well, now around that same time, there was also another free Unix that was emerging called FreeBSD, but it never quite got off the ground as far as Linux did. But it's still going today. It's very strong in some sectors. Did you ever have any contact with that, or why did you not end up using that?
Yes, I had I had a number of contacts. The way that it started actually was Dr. Dobbs ran a series of articles on porting BSD, the Unix from Berkeley, to PCs. And they ran this series of articles showing how they were porting the system, 386 BSD. And it ran over a series of months. And I believe that at some point they released the software, but there was a little bit of a technicality in that BSD relied on some proprietary pieces from the people that owned Unix at the time, which was AT&T. So there were efforts to have a clean version of BSD and different approaches at having a clean version. So some folks took 386 BSD and made NetBSD, And there was a disagreement over the direction between the team members of where BSD should go. So it split up between two groups, FreeBSD and NetBSD. And then there was a disagreement among the NetBSD crowd again over the direction. And this led to the fork between OpenBSD and NetBSD. And I took sides in some of these arguments. I might have made one of my worst blunders email, forgot to remove somebody in the CC in this era. But there was a little bit of a concern that BSD might be prevented from surviving. There was a lawsuit between AT&T and a company that had embraced one of these BSDs called BSDI. So there was a little bit of that concern. And the other piece that happened at the time was that the Linux people moved very quickly to build a thing called shared libraries. And they were a hack. They were not the shared libraries that we have come to use and love and have a really good design. It was really a hacky version of shared libraries, the kind of ugly hack that you would expect from a DOS program. But it worked. It worked, and it meant that it used a lot less disk space. So for me, the big win really was that while Linux was more unstable than BSD, I could fit it on my machine. So I still had to use the university computer I was using. I still had to use it for DOS operations, and I could dedicate a small sliver of the disk to Linux. And I couldn't afford that with BSD. So for me, the choice at the time was simple. Despite the instability of Linux, it was worth having it for that reason.
Well, and then, and then you got into developing for it yourself. As you were saying, you were trying to give back in some way. And you decided to basically clone a popular DOS program, which, and it's funny because I'm sure a lot of people watching or listening today have no idea what DOS was.
Yes. True.
But yeah, so DOS was a text-only, very basic operating system that was on early PC computers, and but they had a very popular file manager program called Norton Commander, and it was basically it was a way of, for a lot of people who didn't want to have to type commands to do stuff. It was something they really liked. There was a way to copy a file from one directory to another. Like nowadays, people think that that's a basic thing, that it's just something you do automatically. But at that time, being able to copy something with one keystroke, it was amazing, and people loved it. They loved this program, Norton Commander.
Yeah, and it had a good UI. It was well done, and I love DOS, and it opened the doors to understand how a DOS system worked at the time. So yeah, when I moved to Unix, I did miss that agility that came with a file manager. So it was one of my early contributions to the space, having essentially a clone of that Norton Commander for Linux.
Yeah. And your program was called what? You didn't say the name.
It was called Mouseless Commander, because Linux at the time didn't have mouse support. So it was, one of the big things about this Norton Commander file manager was that you could use the mouse, right? So you could click and copy files and choose where to copy them. So my clone didn't have mouse support. So it was initially called the Mouseless Commander. And later, this engineer out of Italy, Alessandro Rubin, I can't remember his name. Anyways, he wrote a driver for mice in Linux that I could use. So he collaborated with me in adding mouse support to the Norton Commander, to the Mouseless Commander. So it became the Mouseless Commander with mouse support, which I thought was funny, but the community of people thought it was ridiculous. So they held a vote, and we renamed it Midnight Commander by popular demand, which was probably 7 votes versus 3 or whatever. It wasn't a big election, but we changed the name at the time, and that became the Midnight Commander.
Yeah. Okay. And it is still a program that other people are developing even today. So if you, and now, and I'm trying, is it available for Windows and Mac? It is available for Mac. I know that.
I don't know if it's available for Windows, but it is for Mac. I use it every day. Every day. There's not one day I don't use it. If I turn this Mac, you'll probably see it. But if I do it, it's going to switch the audio again. But yeah, I use it every day. I use it every day. Works on Mac, works on Linux. I'm sure it works. I'm sure somebody has running on Windows. In fact, I think that when the Windows people wanted to show their new terminal, the new terminal emulator, they showed the Midnight Commander. For some reason, the Midnight Commander is one of the few apps that use color on the Linux terminal. So it ends up in every screenshot that you can imagine. So every time somebody does a terminal, there's a screenshot of the Midnight Commander in there. so I get to see it a lot.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure that's fun. Then over time, you had so basically, you and other programmers, especially the GNU ones, had developed this suite of command line utilities and programming libraries and whatnot, text editors, but also then people began to start thinking about graphical software from an open source standpoint, and and in the proprietary Unix systems that were out there, they had their own graphical systems, but I mean, frankly, they were pretty rudimentary. The Sun had one that was called Open Windows that literally it had one button on the Windows, I think. And
I liked it.
You liked it. Okay, interesting.
I liked Open Windows, and they made a lot of those things open source before we called them open source. So I would say that Sun was ahead of their time, but they had a I would say the design system was a little bit odd for people to embrace. They have those round buttons before it was popular, and they had a few ideas that were not quite common for Windows people to see. And there was a competitor called Motif that I believe HP and others used with a desktop environment called the Common Desktop Environment, CDE. So there were definitely user interfaces for Unix, and they worked fine as long as you had powerful hardware. So I would say the first challenge that Linux had on the UI front was the graphical system that we could get our hands on, called X11, was just not powerful. It was just too complex for the kind of hardware that we had at the time, and for the kind of graphics cards that we had at the time, and for the kind of optimizations that we could drop in the graphic cards. So it was just initially a really terrible experience, the graphical user interface in Linux. So it would take time. It would take years for hardware to get better. It would take device drivers to get better, machines to get better, before a serious attempt could be made to bring a user interface to Linux.
Well, and I think one of the other limitations that they had was that they were trying to use Adobe Postscript, which was developed to be a printer programming language, interface. They were trying to use it as a display interface. And that PostScript is very complicated and limited. So like Open Windows, as I recall, was in PostScript, one version.
Yes, that's right. Yes, they did. They did use PostScript, and it did work fine for Sun, but it definitely didn't work for Linux, and it was very, very slow. In fact, when we tried, before we launched our own effort for the Linux desktop, we tried using this technology, and it was just, there was not enough memory or power at the time for us to run it. It was not optimized. We couldn't make it work at the time, 1997. So yeah, it was a shame. It's a good idea, but not great.
Yeah, well, and Apple kind of imagined that concept later when they came back to Unix. And because the Quartz system is based in PDF, which is, of
Yes,
course, a descendant
right,
of PostScript. But I guess we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So, so people were wanting to have an open and free software. Free software, of course, for those not familiar, meaning that you have access to the source code and you can modify the software and redistribute it. That's sort of the quick and dirty definition of it. And so so people who wanted a graphical environment for their open source software, they began trying to come up with their own versions of it. And I guess, some of the early ones out there, let's see, I guess, I don't know if TWM was, how old that one is, but that certainly was an old
it
one.
was quite old, but TWM
but I think,
was a window manager, so it didn't really do much in terms of having a full system.
Yeah, but I'm thinking though, I guess you could say After Step might be the first sort of attempt to try to copy that. And would you say that, or would you say some other one?
Well, it depends, right? So there's a couple of things. One was the look and the behavior of your windows, and that was handled in the X Windows system by window managers. So there was TWM, which was very old. There was FVWM, which was highly configurable and very popular for a while. And it led
but was also just a window manager too, then.
Yep, and it led to the creation of FVWM 95, which was starting to get some attributes of a desktop by cloning the Windows 95 UI, but it was lacking everything else, from control settings, from control centers to settings, to printer, to managing applications, to associating application types with software, and so on. So it was kind of a progression of, on the one hand, people building window managers, which was a natural place to put this work. People having UI toolkits like TickleTK for rapidly building applications, or GTK or XD or LessD for Java had a thing called AWS, and we had clones of that as well going. So it was a very set of disparate attempts at doing these things.
So yeah, there were different attempts to try to create various, as they call them, toolkits. And the one that kind of really started getting rolling was one called Qt, QT, which was put out by a commercial company called Troll Tech, out of, what was it, Finland? Was it, or Sweden? I always forget.
Norway.
Norway. Okay. Norway. See, yeah.
The company was called Troll Tech, so I guess the troll had something to do with Norse mythology, and
presumably, yeah. But and so Qt was a cross-platform toolkit also, which was interesting. There weren't a lot of those, at that time period. So you could write software in it that would run on Windows and Mac, and also on various Unix versions. That was the promise of it. But there were a number of people who were concerned about the license of it, but many were not. And so they began working together on creating a suite of graphical applications, which they called the K desktop environment, which was kind of a play on the common desktop environment, CDE, and they called it KDE. But you were, did you ever use KDE in those early days? What was your,
yes,
I know obviously you didn't get into it eventually.
Well, I was a fan. In fact, like I said, the early Linux days they were fascinating. There was a new thing happening every day, and people sharing their code and ideas. And we were talking about this before the interview, but there was this forum called Comp OS Linux Announce, and that was my drug. I would go there every day to check out what new capability had been unleashed on Linux, right? What new thing it could do, because it seemed like every day brought in a new superpower. And it was a superpower because you have to remember that at the time, Linux was a multitasking and safe operating system, compared to Windows, which had a better UI, but it was not really multitasking. And if one application crashed, it would crash the entire system. So you had to reboot your machine. On Linux, if something crashed, the system kept going. You just restart it again. So Linux in this particular era was magical. It was ugly, but magical, and every day got better, right? So when they announced KDE, I was in awe. I love KDE.
Yeah, and this was 1996, just for everybody keeping track here. Yeah, it was.
But I had been working on had been working with the Red Hat folks on a collaboration on bringing Linux to Spark computers, Sun computers that no longer exist, because I thought the future of Linux was high-end computers, not consumer computers. So I had been working with them, and I had a good relationship with them. I remember sending an email to Eric Trone, who was at Red Hat. And I said, Eric, we got to get this thing on Red Hat. We got to put this UI. This is amazing. This is our ticket, right? And I also sent an email to Richard Stallman, and I said, Richard, we gotta get this thing in GNU, right? And both of them, I don't remember how the separation between these emails, but both of them replied and said, the challenge is that Red Hat said we can't distribute it because the Qt license prohibits us from doing that. And Richards replied something along those lines, which was a shame because we had built something from the ground up, right? We had spent all these years, Richard coming from one end, building the tools, and eventually Linux bringing the other part of the half. So we had struggled, and the community had struggled to get a full system that was free. And all of a sudden, a missing piece, the UI, which at this point, video cards were good enough, the speed of the systems was good enough that it was a reality. All of a sudden, we were willing to give up on those principles of having everything be free for the sake of using this toolkit, Qt from Trolltech. So that was a sad moment, and I kind of decided to go and build an alternative, right? It's like, well, we can use that, we can build an alternative, and we can use some pieces that have been, some pieces of free software that have been created. Let's use those pieces and let's build the desktop from the ground up. So that was the launch of Gnome, and I guess Gnome goes on, goes strong after, I don't know, when did we launch this? 1997. So 20,
yeah.
24 years.
Well, and why don't you? And it had an acronym. What was the acronym? Was it originally an acronym? Yeah.
It had it's a layered set of acronyms. It actually stood for. We repurposed that acronym from another project into this one, but it was the GNU Network Object Model Environment. And the reality is that before we did the desktop, GNOME, the desktop, we wanted to build a reusable component system, which is where the GNOME name comes from. So we had the name, and we had started to think about writing a reusable software inspired by what Microsoft was doing with COM. But we didn't really get a chance to build it when this sort of high-level emergency, hey, the future of the desktop, we risk giving it up because it's going to be proprietary. So we just repurposed the name of the project, so we didn't have to think too much about this, and that's where we went off to the races. I think that to this day the logo of GNOME is a foot, and the story of that is interesting. There was this artist in the community called Tuomas Huosmanen, and Tuomas had done a lot of drawings with a paint program, one of these free paint programs on Linux called the GIMP. And he had made a lot of little things that look cute. And when we were building the desktop, I said, hey, do you mind if I use this icon for the mail app or the settings app or the clock or this or that? So we were building applications, so we needed icons. And we just asked Tuomas, can we use your artwork? So we used a lot of his artwork. And he started to do some artwork for us. And every day there will be something, and hey, do you have a use for this or not? And we would use it or not. And just before we did the first launch of GNOME, or there was one icon that we had found absolutely no use for, and it was a foot. And we decided to take that foot and put it on the equivalent of Windows Start menu. And we just put it there because that was the only icon that we had drawn and had no use assigned yet. So we put that icon there, and that became the Gnome logo. And we've restyled it over the years, but this is, we ended up with that because that was the sole surviving artwork asset that we didn't know what to do with.
Oh, okay, huh? Yeah, I guess I wonder how many people know that that story.
About a dozen people know the story, but so
yeah.
anyways,
Well, yeah. So that was 1999, roughly, when you guys went public with that.
Was it?
Yeah, at least that's what Wikipedia thinks.
Okay, so. Fair enough. Yes.
Yeah. So. And then, at that point, having all of these graphical versions, graphical software environments in Linux actually kind of set, and you had the internet gold rush at the same time with a lot of these startup companies. Yes. And then Linux was really starting to emerge as a full, complete set of software. And so it kind of set off its own little gold rush in a sense. And so you had companies like Corel go into it. And Corel was, at the time was this big desktop application vendor that was making Corel Draw and Photo Paint and WordPerfect. And they had purchased that from, they purchased WordPerfect Corporation. So they were big. They were a big deal in the application world at that time, and they decided that they were going to get into Linux themselves, and so they launched their own Linux desktop to try to compete with Windows and Macintosh.
Right. Yeah.
And it didn't quite go. It didn't quite end in the success that they wanted it to be, but it kind of sort of. I want to say they were kind of the first big investment in Linux at that time period, in such a big way.
Yes.
And so it kind of set a pattern. I think it put Linux on the map in terms of corporate, corporate technology world. That hey, this is something to look at because at least on the server side. People obviously were getting into the internet, but a lot of websites at that time were being served in proprietary Unix or on FreeBSD. That was who kind of dominated that space. So, so Linux began gaining some attention here, and but hadn't really taken off to the degree that it ended up later getting attention. And then you guys kept refining GNOME over various releases, and so did KDE. And KDE actually had created a web browser that was also a file manager called Conqueror, and Conqueror was later adopted by Apple and to become their Safari browser. At the original basis for that, and then which Google then turned into Chrome. So, but these were so these were all things that sort of people who were paying attention were you guys were obviously, I'm sure, very excited about all this stuff happening. But you guys still hadn't hit the full big time like you had wanted, I guess, right? And then that was around. Well, I was going to say, and you wanted to keep expanding GNOME and into other areas, which is how you kind of got started into Mono. You want to talk about that and what that was supposed to be?
Yeah, it's like I said. I mean, I think that there was a lot of excitement, and 1999. I don't remember when Red Hat went public. I'm sure we can look this up, but I believe that VA Linux was the second company to go public in 1999. And like you said, there was a gold rush of companies around the internet at the time going public and making millions of dollars. And that's the year that that I joined forces with this guy, Matt Friedman. We wanted to build our own company. We wanted to build our own company around Gnome. So we said, hey, we've built Gnome. Let's go and build a company around that. So we launched our company in 1999. That's how I ended up in the United States. And in fact, in Boston, because he was graduating from MIT. And we did launch our company. And, once you're a company, and you have some venture capital, you have a lot of additional pieces to play with. We could fill in a lot of the gaps, a lot of the things that were not being done to GNOME, we did. We fixed a bunch of bugs and usability problems. We could hire full-time artists, right? So rather than pick the foot that nobody had taken, the only icon that was spare, we could actually have designers go and build those icons that we needed. So we did that. That company we did from 1999 until we sold it to Novell in 2003. But at the same time, like I said, around 2002 or so, I was worried that GNOME was not growing fast enough, and that while we certainly had some applications being built, it was painful to do them. We're using a low-level language. It was difficult to build. It was error-prone. We actually, at the company that we started called Zemian, we were trying to clone Outlook, right? Microsoft Outlook. So bring calendaring, email, and contacts and synchronization to Linux. And
in order to get big companies to be interested in Linux.
Yes, and we wanted to enable. Yeah, and this is before the web, and the web is in its infancy, right? And so things like Gmail are, far away in the distance. So it was so painful to build this thing. It was incredibly painful. We're spending all of our VC money debugging low-level code and barely making any progress. It was slow. It was a bear. But computers at the time were very slow, so you couldn't really afford to use. Today you could use JavaScript or Python or whatever, high-level language and get away with it. In 1999, these were really bad choices. So we were developing with a low-level language. So by 2002, it was clear that we needed a better way of building this software, or 2001, and there was nothing really on the menu that we could use. And this is when Microsoft released Microsoftnet, and we said, well, this is exactly what we need. It's a compiled language, but it's also high level enough that we can use it for to move faster. It might be a little bit more computationally expensive, but it's within the realm of computers in 2001. And we couldn't use Java for the same reason that we couldn't use Crawltech at the time, which is the license was not open source. So we said, well, we can't use Java, and Java is kind of a monster. And there's this new Microsoft thing called .NET. They're making all the specifications public, so let's go and clone that. So we re-implemented those specifications. And that led to the Mono project in 2000. I can't remember. We're going to have to Wikipedia these, but 2001, 2002. Once you get started there, initially I just wanted to have a tool for us to build better software. And as you keep building it, you find new interesting challenges and opportunities and users and things that you could do with it. So, I started in this 2000 era on .NET, and I kept going. To this day, I still contribute to .NET, but so it's been almost 20 years of that.
Yeah. Well, it looks like it was 2004 was the initial release, so 17 years ago.
But
of Mono.
That was 1.0. The Mono announcement was at a O'Reilly conference, and we didn't have very much code. What was that? When was that? Yeah, 2004 was the official release, but we announced it years before that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in December of 2000. Okay, here it is, December of 2000. Yeah, and I announced it officially in July 19, 2001. So we had kind of the basics of the compiler, I believe, of the C# compiler. We were not self-hosting. I think we went self-hosting by the end of the summer. So it was a very aggressive timeline. But I remember working during my vacation in Mexico. I went vacation into Mexico in 2000, and I was working on that there.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and so how a lot of people didn't like Mono though, of what you guys were doing, right? They were
right, because it was
offended at that.
Yes, some people were offended that it was a clone of a Microsoft technology, and Microsoft in 2000 was deeply distrusted for many reasons. Microsoft had taken a very antagonistic position towards Linux, and my view was, it's a good technology. We should use the technology. And some people felt that we shouldn't encourage the use of a technology designed by Microsoft. And then over time, things got a little bit worse, right? In 2006, my employer at the time, Novell, signed a patent license agreement with Microsoft over, I don't remember the details, but the high level is we won't sue you, you won't sue us over Linux, we won't sue you over your Windows. And that was seen as maybe there is a submarine patent in Mono that will destroy Linux. So the same mistrust, right, that I had for other folks, some people had towards these things, or the same distrust that hey, we can't build a future on Trolltech or Java. Now some people are saying, well, we can't build our future on Mono either, which I thought was a little bit extreme, but I can understand why some people had that feeling. And that distrust actually went on for years. I mean, this, like I said, we started in 2000. I think it was okay until that agreement in around 2006. And then it remained really on shaky grounds ever since. And I would say that it only really turned a corner when Microsoft themselves said, we are open sourcing our version of .NET from the ground up. And you are okay to use it for whatever purposes you deem in 2015 or 2016. So it was, there were 15 years of internet flame wars over patent and copyright minutia.
Yeah.
Well, 15 years I'm not getting back.
Yeah. Well, and I guess and Richard Stallman was one of those critics, was he not?
Well, so Richard took it in. So Richard was one of the original people endorsing the Mono project. He had concerns, though. He had concerns over the technical decision that compilers are separated, the front ends are separated from the back end, because he used the strategy effectively to force some proprietary languages to be open sourced. So he had success with that approach. So he didn't like the fact that there was an intermediate representation that would allow proprietary compilers from existence. So he wanted to stamp those out. But eventually he accepted it. And it got more complicated in my company, right? My company that did open source software. Eventually, we realized that if you make pure open source software, nobody's going to give you money. So we started to sell proprietary software, and that annoyed Richard Stallman tremendously. So this was.
And what was the software you were selling?
We were selling an extension to our Evolution software suite. So it was an extension that allowed it to talk to Exchange servers, to Microsoft Exchange. So we said, hey, listen, the software is free, but if you're going to connect a proprietary server, we'll sell you a proprietary extension. And that was my fallout with Richard Stallman. And it, that was, I want to say 2001 or 2002, perhaps. I can't remember. But we had we were no longer, on speaking terms after that. And he saw Mono from the eyes of, one day it might be proprietary. So he did start a competing project to Mono called .GNU. So there was more than one .NET reimplementation. It was Mono, which was ours, and then there was .GNU that was from other folks on the internet.
Yeah. Well, and I guess, while this was sort of settling, in the meantime, you had the kind of the emergence of smartphones because they had existed for a long time, primarily, primarily initially as a descendant of Windows CE from Microsoft.
Yep.
That had most of the early mindshare, the earliest mindshare grew out of PDAs, and then you had the other one that was the descendant of the Cyan computers, which was Epic.
Palm Pilots.
No, that was the third one was Palm Pilots, but no, Epic, which later turned into Symbian.
Okay.
And then you had the Palm Pilots gradually acquired some cellular functionality, but all of these programs ultimately were very fractured, and they had some severe limitations, whether it was in terms of memory or the processors were a huge limitation, obviously.
Right.
And then you had BlackBerry come along, so the market was in a lot of ways it was very similar to the way Unix was before Linux. And so you had these four big vendors that nothing they did was compatible with each other, and that was by design, and many of them were hardware vendors as well. Smartphones, they were kind of a geek accessory. If you were involved in the technology industry, or you were a journalist, or a professor, or something like that, or a computer science person, you had them, or like a traveling businessman or something like that. That was were the people who had them. And then Apple came out with the iPhone, and that just drastically changed the phone market forever. And around that time, when the iPhone, and let me just the iPhone came out in 2007. And so, but while it was under wraps, Google was also working on a phone as well. And they had designed Android to be kind of a clone of BlackBerry at the time, initially in the private betas. And then when Apple came out with the iPhone in 2007, they threw everything in the trash for Android, as they were calling it, and then redesigned it. But the interesting thing about what Google was doing was that they were using Linux as the core for it, as the kernel, and then and then they eventually rejiggered it to kind of be very similar to the iPhone. And then you had Palm, which also threw its Palm OS in the trash can and started off with Linux as well, with their, in my opinion, very underappreciated web OS. I was a fan.
I was a fan too. I have one. The other day I found the box. Anyways.
A pre? Yeah.
I have a pre somewhere in the office.
Yeah. Well, and so that just revolutionized everything. But Google did not use one of the pre-existing Linux toolkits like Qt or GTK.
Right.
Instead, they decided to use a modified version of Java as their foundation. Now, how did you guys feel about all that in the Mono community when you got word that they were doing that? Because did you guys feel like you could have been a contender, and it was taken away from you, or what?
Yeah.
What did you guys think about all that?
I wish I could remember how we felt. I mean, I was a fan of Android because it was Linux based. It was certainly a shame that it was based on Java. And like you said, they were inspired by BlackBerry, and the design of Android was inspired by the limitations of BlackBerry. So it was really intended to be running on super low power devices. And And this is the sin that Android carries to this day. This is what makes Android so difficult to program nowadays, because you're still programming the way that you would program a system with very little memory, right? So these mistakes that were made, in 2000, whatever, 2007 or so, we're still paying for those today. I don't remember how we felt at the time, but I remember that we tried to push mono. We said this is maybe better for you. I remember that when the lawsuit between Oracle and Google came out, that some documents, some internal emails came out advocating to use .NET or C#, and Google outright saying, "Oh, this is a bad idea because of some reason." And I remember getting very angry at the reason, because it was a lie, right? So somebody either did not understand well enough, or pretended to understand things well enough, and they made that judgment call that was the wrong judgment call, because very clearly they were in a more precarious situation with Java, the way that I saw it, and they ended up in that lawsuit. But I don't remember exactly how I felt at that particular time about their use of Java. But I did like that it was Linux-based. That was exciting. I followed the development. Some of my friends went to work on Android. It was like an exciting time. It was a very exciting world. But then, Apple released the iPhone, and it was not designed to be a BlackBerry replacement, right? It was designed to be a full Unix system with very good taste, right, and very good UI, much better than what we had built over the years on Linux, right? We've struggled so much with so many of these things, and it was incredible to watch Apple execute so well from the get-go on this thing. So, yeah, so I fell in love with the iPhone very quickly.
Yeah. Well, I guess it might have been, both Google and Android, decided not to even bother with X11 as well. And I think that probably was a big factor in their ability to start quickly.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. For not using C#, that was a separate discussion. But yeah, they didn't choose any of my stuff.
Yeah. Well, okay. So Xamarin was under the Novell umbrella for a few years up until that point, and then Novell got acquired by another company called Attachmate, which was kind of more in the corporate consulting management type services.
Yeah.
And then that brought a change for you guys as well. Let's talk about that. And when was that?
Yeah, they acquired the company. Attachmate purchased Novell, and then they laid off, I think, about 1,000 people right off the bat. My team and the product where we're bringing .NET to iPhones and Androids was laid off, and we very quickly. So it was a blessing, right? It was very stressful, but it was a blessing. As soon as they laid off the team, in fact, they called me to the office and said, "Hey, we want to talk to you." It's like, "Oh, excellent, perfect. What are we going to talk about?" It's like, "Hey, we need you to lay off your team, and once you're done, you're laid off too." So.
And this was 2011.
2011, yes.
Yeah.
So I had to lay off my team, the American team. The European team was more difficult because of European regulations. So they stayed at Novell employed for a few months as they sorted out what to do. But the American team was laid off immediately. And, and I said, "Hey, folks, let's start something." So I rehired them. And again, I called my friend that I had founded the first company. He was on a 1-year break. He decided he was going to travel the world for a year. And he was in some island in the Caribbean. I said, "Hey, we just got laid off and I'm starting this company. I could use your coaching." So, he was coaching me on a few things about, how to incorporate, which lawyers to use, that sort of thing. And one day he says, "Hey, do you mind if I join the company?" It's like, "Oh, that would be amazing." So he cut his vacation short. I think he was in month 6 out of a year, and flew back to Boston. He said, "Well, but my wife says, can we wait until Thursday?" because we just got here. So they flew on Thursday, and we incorporated the company. He put in some money, I put in some money. We rehired the team. And we set out to build a company. And so we were so lucky. It was a great product for the right moment, for the right platform, which was bringing .NET developers to iPhone and Android. And so we launched a company in 2011, and we sold the company to Microsoft in 2016. And that's how I ended up at Microsoft after after spending 15 years trying to unseat them, right? Competing at every turn, desktops, kernels, office suites, runtimes, compilers, and so on.
Yeah. Well, now, how did that come about? Did you guys approach them, or did they approach you?
We had a long-going partnership because we were using .NET, so we gave them feedback on what we wanted from .NET. We had joint customers, people that were using their technology, our technology. So we had a bunch of different go-to-market plans and sales events together. So we had a very close relationship with them for almost, I would say, maybe 3 years, 2 to 3 years. So eventually they reached out to us, and we started talking about an acquisition in, I can't remember, 2015, end of 2015. There was a previous attempt a year before, but didn't go very far.
Okay. Well, and I guess now, were they partially motivated also though by trying to, they were trying to promote their own Windows phone operating system during that time? Was that related to that?
Some of it, but I think that Windows Phone was already sunset by, I think that Windows Phone was already sunset when the acquisition took place. But certainly the idea was to have a single language. They had .NET on servers and Windows desktops, and we gave them .NET on Macs, on Android, on iOS, and other rare platforms like S390 and other things like that. So, and it was a compelling product, right? We were selling into the iPhone market, and we had a lot of customers. So.
Okay, yeah, and actually I just looked at it. It looks like everything kind of ended around 2014, roughly.
Yeah, which to us was a little bit of a setback, right? Just because a big part of our promise is the same code that you use on Android and iOS, you can use on Windows Phone. So when they sunset Windows Phone, it also kind of took away some of the value that we gave. Right, so it was a matter of product. It was still valuable, just we lost a chunk of the value.
Yeah, well, although it did enable them to have an ability to have developers within the other two dominant operating systems that had emerged. So at this point now, though, here in September 29th of 2021, we're sitting here now where, Android is overwhelmingly the dominant operating system in phones, and Linux is the server operating system. Where do you see things? I guess that's kind of a big question here, and you don't have a lot of time, so.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? Linux is, when I started to help Linux, I wanted to see Linux as my desktop computer. I wanted to use it for everything that I did. It was something that really appealed to my younger self. And sadly, Linux on the desktop still, hasn't quite unfolded the way that I wanted. I think the closest that you can get today is a Chromebook, right? Which is the OS from the ground up running Linux, although half the services, it's really connected to a Python service. Yeah. So, and Android is a little bit that way. So Linux didn't quite manifest that way. That's how I ended up with all these Macs. But you know, I have a thermostat around here. It's a Linux machine, right? The shower control is a Linux machine. I was looking at my network activity, and a bunch of these things are Linux boxes, right? So Linux is now everywhere, right? And
Yeah.
so it succeeded in ways I would have never imagined, and sadly did not quite make it on the one place that, you know, the place where I spend my whole day in and out, right? And you know, maybe I could continue using it, right? But I think that I'm speaking as a general market. I really wish that Linux had taken over by storm the consumer market, and that didn't quite happen. So, anyways.
Yeah, but I guess it's kind of an example of how, you know, sometimes we can succeed in ways that we didn't plan, and I mean, ultimately, you know, as a number of people using it, it's much greater than if it had taken over the desktop. You could argue.
And there's some good marketers that caution against that, right? Don't do a frontal assault on the incumbent, right? You're much better off offering products in different segments. So now I know, right? I wish that I had known 20 years ago, but you know, this is now well-studied phenomena that a frontal assault is very expensive, very difficult, and you're always going to be chasing every single nook and cranny. So anyways, so now I know. So my next effort, I'm not going to do a frontal assault. I'll find new markets.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time today. We could probably talk for hours and hours more. So, but you're a busy guy, so I appreciate
Thank you very much,
being here. All right, it's a great conversation. All right, great. Bye. It was a great conversation today with Miguel de Icaza, and so as I said, it's a little bit different than our typical political and historical fare here at Theory of Change, but technology is a very important part of our world, and in many ways plays a role in our lives that we don't often even understand or are aware of. So let's definitely keep an eye on all of that. And appreciate you guys being here with me today. And just wanted to, as a matter of a little bit of housekeeping here. So Theory of Change is part of the Flux community. Flux is a new media network and website, and it's a new website out there for people who are interested in politics, technology, media, and how they all kind of influence each other, and also with a big focus on religion as well. And so Theory of Change is one of a number of podcasts that you can find at flux.community. So I encourage everybody, if you haven't checked out Flux yet, to please go ahead and do so. And if you'd like the show, please do feel free to visit our Patreon for Flux. We are at patreon.com/discoverflux. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody being here today. I'm Matthew Sheffield, and I'll see you guys next week.